our first Grow video, and we hope that it's helpful to you. We hope that it's encouraging to you. And we're going to use these short videos to encourage you, to give you some food for thought as we work our way through this time of isolation and separation and quarantine that we find ourselves in. The COVID-19 situation is something that's unique. It's something that we've never experienced before in our lifetimes. It's something that kind of took us by surprise a little bit. And it's something that is provoking some serious questions. Our governor has issued an order that we are not to assemble in groups larger than 10. And when we do get together in groups, we have to stay at least 6 feet apart. Well, these orders make it impossible for us to physically assemble on a weekly basis like we normally would do for church. So that raises the question, if this situation continues for much longer, are we sinning by not assembling together? The governor has told us that this could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, it could be 90 days before we reach the end of this situation where we find ourselves in these orders, these restrictions that we are living under at the moment. So what are we to do? Is it a sin for us to stop assembling physically for that period of time? And the question arises because of the text of Scripture in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. Let me read it together. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. He tells the church, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Don't do it. Do not do that. There are some in his audience that he's writing to who have stopped assembling. And the author of Hebrews is saying that is wrong. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that the same for us? Is it wrong for us to not assemble because the governor has ordered us to? Are we being forced into a situation where we have to choose between obeying God or obeying man? Well, I think we need to understand this passage. It's a legitimate question. It's a valid question. It's a question we need to think about. Hebrews is a wonderful book, and it was a book that was written to believers who were struggling to endure in the face of persecution. They were being tempted to turn away from Christ in order to preserve their lives, in order to keep themselves safe. They were being tempted to abandon Christ and abandon Christianity and to slide back into the umbrella of Judaism, because Judaism was a protected religion. In the first century, Christianity was not a protected religion. It was being persecuted. They were being marginalized. They were being ostracized. They were being arrested, and some of them were being executed. And these individuals were afraid. They were afraid of being persecuted. They were afraid of being targeted for their faith in Christ. And so they were thinking, if we don't get together, if we don't assemble together, if we just kind of avoid one another, we can avoid danger. We can avoid being persecuted. We can avoid this kind of unwanted attention. But the danger is, because of that, they were in danger of abandoning Christ. The whole book of Hebrews is written to urge believers to hold fast to Christ no matter the cost. No matter what it costs you, never abandon Jesus Christ. Never abandon Jesus Christ. And in order to hold fast to Christ, who is shown repeatedly throughout the book of Hebrews to be far superior to Judaism. Judaism cannot save you. Only Christ can save you. Christ's sacrifice is better. Christ's priesthood is better. Christ is better than Moses. Christ is the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament has been talking of. And to turn away from Christ is to turn away from God. It's to turn away from truth. And it's to turn away from salvation. And so the author is writing Hebrews to say, do not abandon Christ, even if it means you are persecuted, even if it means you are imprisoned, even if it means you're executed. Do not turn away from Christ. Now, brothers and sisters, we need one another. In times of fear, in times of panic, in times of uncertainty, in times of temptation, we need each other to help one another hold fast to Christ. In fact, he says this in the book of Hebrews. If you look at chapter 3 for just a moment, at verse 12, he says, take care, brethren, lest there should be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart in falling away from the living God. but encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, lest any one of you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. Do you hear what he's saying? Take care lest there be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart, masquerading as a believing heart. Well, how are you to take care? How are you to prevent that from happening? He says in the next verse, encourage one another day after day, as long as it is called today, lest you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Sin is a trickster. Sin is a deceiver. Sin is subtle. It creeps into your life and attaches itself to you and begins to pull you away from Christ. And if you don't have brothers and sisters who are willing to speak truth into your life, who are willing to encourage you to turn back to Jesus, then you can be pulled away from Christ. You can fall into grave sin. You can bring about destruction in your life and your family's life, great pain and great misery. And this is what the author of Hebrews is warning about. And when it comes down to chapter 10, he says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Let us hold tightly to Christ. Let us cling desperately to Christ. No matter the storm around us, let us cling desperately to Christ. Because Christ alone saves. Christ alone delivers. How do we do that? How do we cling to Christ? Well, he says that in verse 24. He says, let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. If we're to cling to Christ, we need each other to stimulate us, to stir us up, to encourage us, to motivate us to loving God and loving each other, to doing the works of obedience that Jesus has taught us to do. If we are to be faithful to Jesus, if we are to keep trusting in Jesus, we need one another to stimulate us, to encourage us, to stir us up to love and good deeds. We need each other. Christianity is not a Lone Ranger religion. You cannot do this on your own. You need fellow believers, because fellow believers watch out for you. They see the deceptiveness. They see the trickery of sin. They see you being pulled away by the enemy, and they can run to your rescue, and they can help you. They can bring you back to Christ, in a sense. So how do believers stir one another up? How do we stimulate one another? How do we encourage one another? Look at what he says in verse 25. Not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So how are believers to stimulate or to stir up one another to love for God, love for others, and obedience? How are we to do that? Well, in this first century, the only way they could do that was by assembling together. The only way they could communicate with one another, the only way they could talk with one another, the only way that they could encourage one another was to actually be in the presence of one another and talk. They didn't have phones. They didn't have email. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have Snapchat. They didn't have Zoom calling. They didn't have any of those kinds of things. They could only communicate. They could only encourage. They could only help one another by actually being in the presence of one another. For them to be separated physically from one another was to be truly isolated, was to be truly alone, was to be truly separate, because they had no other means of communication. I mean, they could send a letter, but that was very, very expensive. It was not something that anyone did on a normal basis. It was not something the average person did very regularly, especially the more impoverished part of society. So the only way they could obey the command to stimulate and to stir up and to encourage one another to be faithful to Jesus in the face of hostility, in the face of temptation, was by being together and talking together. Is that the situation we find ourselves in today? I don't think so. I don't think so. This command, the emphasis of the command is not on assembling. Assembling is the means by which we obey the command. Assembling is simply a means, the chief means for the original audience to obey this command, to stir up and stimulate, encourage one another as long as we see the day, as long as we have time, as long as we are here on this earth. We need each other to encourage one another, to help one another to grow in Christ. But today, we are being asked to not physically assemble for a short period of time in order to stop the spread of a very dangerous virus. We're not being asked to do this because we're Christians. In fact, this is a request, an order that is for all people of all faiths, of all group types. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you believe. All groups are asked and ordered to not gather together physically because of the spread of this virus. It's not because we're Christians. We're not being persecuted because we're Christians. We're not being asked to stop assembling because we're Christians. No. We're being asked to do this for a temporary period of time in order to stop the spread of a virus, in order to save people's lives. And to show love to others, we can refuse to physically gather. In order to obey our governing authorities, as Romans 13 tells us, we can stop assembling physically for a period of time. But that doesn't mean that we're being disobedient to this text. This text is urging us to communicate with one another, to help one another, to stir up one another to love for God, love for each other, and good deeds, obedience to God. So how do we do that? We have all kinds of technological means at our disposal to do that. We can call each other. We can text each other. We can FaceTime each other. We can communicate on Facebook or Instagram with pictures and videos of one another. We can Zoom conference call where many people can get together and have a meeting and have a conversation and have a discussion about anything and everything. We can communicate on a regular basis even though we're not physically in the same space. And thus, we can stimulate, stir up, and encourage one another to love and good deeds. So I do not think that we're being disobedient to this text by refusing to assemble together physically for a short period of time. Now, some might say, well, Phil, does that mean that it doesn't matter if we assemble together at all? I mean, maybe this is just the new normal for church. We don't get together in groups. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I think even now we're experiencing kind of withdrawal from one another. We are created to be community. We are created by our God to be in community with one another. Most all people have that need to be with other people, to have interaction with other people. We crave that kind of interaction. We crave communication. We crave physical presence. Now, video screens and phone calls and Zoom calls, they can help bridge the gap, but they do not replace the physical presence. Just as an example. Just recently, I traveled to Israel with some students on a trip. I was gone for about 10 days and desperately missed my family. My family missed me. But this time was different because I was able to FaceTime. I've traveled overseas in the past and it was hard because we could only talk occasionally or we could only text. And it was hard. I couldn't see their faces. They couldn't see my face. And we were communicating, but it was not the same. We missed one another. And this trip, well, it was still hard. It was better because I could actually see their faces. I could see the emotion. Now, it was still not the same because I couldn't reach through the phone and touch them and hug them and hold them. And I still missed them. But the separation was much more manageable because of that technological opportunity. I still was excited when I got to come home. And they were excited for me to come home because there is no substitute, true substitute, that takes the place of your physical presence with someone else. So brothers and sisters, does this mean we shouldn't ever assemble together again? No, that's not what it means at all. We should, because that is the best way to encourage and help and minister to one another. But in a time of crisis like this, in a time in which our government is asking everyone to slow down and to separate for a short season of time, we can do this because we can still obey God even as we're separate. So how do we do that? Let's just, as we conclude, let's just talk about a few really practical ways that we can love one another, we can love God, we can stir up one another to love for God, love for each other, and good deeds, obedience. Number one, our care groups. We just rolled out care groups. You should have received a letter in the mail just this week encouraging you to call the other members of your care group. There are 7 families on each care group. And so every Monday night, you have this family that you're going to call. On every Tuesday night, you have a different family you're going to call. On every Wednesday, you're going to have a third family you're going to call, all the way through Saturday. Not only will you be making a call, you will be receiving a call from somebody else in that care group. So every day, you're going to be talking to at least 2 different members of the church family in order to encourage each other. And it doesn't have to be a complex, weird conversation. Just talk. Just chat. Just spend a few minutes talking to each other about life. How are you doing? You guys holding up all right? Is there anything you guys need? You know, especially if you have an older church member in your care group, ask them, do they need you to go to the store for them? Do they need something done for them that they're not able to get out and do for themselves? And what you're going to discover is some people are really lonely. Now, my family, there's 9 of us in the house, and there's not really too many places in the house you can go and actually be alone. I mean, there's people everywhere. But that's not the case for a lot of people. A lot of people live alone. They are isolated. And unless someone calls them or they call somebody else, they don't have anyone else to talk to. This is a tremendous opportunity for us to love one another. And you say, well, I just don't like talking on the phone. I feel uncomfortable with that. It makes me feel uncomfortable. Yes, I understand that. I'm not a big phone person either. But the reality is, this is a sacrifice you can make in order to show love to someone who's lonely, to encourage and stimulate one another. And I would urge you to not just call, but FaceTime. There's something about seeing the face of each other that's good. So I encourage you, use your care group, work your care group, make your calls and receive your calls, help one another and pray with one another as best you can. The second thing we can do, Make an FBC, is watch the live stream at 10:30. Now, I really want to encourage you about this. Don't treat the live stream like a show that you can DVR and watch later at your convenience. Now, occasionally that might be the case, but we are meeting intentionally in a live event at the same time so that our whole church family, even though we are physically separated, we're all doing the same thing at the same time. We're all singing the same songs. We're all praying the same prayers. And we're all listening to the same word. We're all responding with the same obedience. We need to do this together. And I want you to take it seriously. Don't just sit there and watch the live stream like it's a TV show. Participate, sing, pray, listen. And you say, well, Pastor Phil, it just feels a little weird singing, with our family. God is worthy of our praises. Whether we're in a large group or whether in a small group, God's worth has not diminished. Do not let your fear of man prevent you from giving God what he is worthy of. He was worthy of our praise. So use the live stream to gather with other believers and pray together and talk, and listen together and learn together. I would encourage you to watch these videos with your family and then use these videos as platforms or launching points to talk to others. Talk on Facebook, talk on Instagram, talk in your social media feeds how you're learning and how you're growing and how you're interacting with your theology, how it's helping you, how you need some questions answered. Just discuss these things as we're bringing topics up. Talk about them, ask questions about them with other believers within the church, and encourage you to watch. And then serving and sharing. How do we do that in isolation? Well, serving one another, calling each other is huge. It's absolutely huge. So please serve one another. Sacrifice your own comfort and serve each other in this way. But as far as sharing, I would encourage you to do this. Share these videos. Share the live stream. Share the links on your pages. Encourage others to watch them and tell them why you think it would be helpful for them to watch. Invite them to the live stream with us. Use these platforms to engage other people with the good news of Jesus Christ. Brothers and sisters, we're in this together. We've not given up on each other. We love you, and we know that you love us. Let's be the church in this time of crisis. Let's show the community of Macon the distinctiveness of our love for one another by the way we care for one another and minister to one another. I'm so thankful that you spent the last 20 minutes together with me. I hope that you're encouraged. I hope that you're helped. And I hope you have a blessed day. Take care.